synagogue roll must be written on the skins of clean animals, prepared for the particular use of the synagogue by a Jew. Every skin must contain a certain number of columns, equal throughout the entire book. The whole copy must be first lined, and if 3 words be written in it without a line, it is worthless. The ink should be black, neither red, green, or any other color, and be prepared according to a definite recipe. An authentic copy must be the exact...
Writing and civilization began at the same time, about 5,000 years ago. And some of these first writings were so powerful that they still influence us today through the books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Now, this great book wasn't just written out by a few holy men in ancient Israel, by Moses and Isaiah and all the rest of them. It developed slowly, almost anonymously, and its character was formed in times of terrible national disaster. To the ancient Israelites, their Bible offered remedies, comfort, and sometimes even a glimpse of God himself. There's a marvelous traditional Jewish story about a lot of rabbis who were having a noisy argument about a point of holy law. On one side of the argument was one rabbi, on the other a great heaving mass of them, all trying to shout him down. So the single rabbi who knew he was right decided to call on God, and he said, God, if I am right, may the trees that stand around us bend to the ground. And miraculously, all the trees bent to the ground. And still they shouted at him. So he called on God again, and he said, God, if I am right, may a heavenly wind blow through this assembly. And a great wind went through the assembly, but it didn't stop the rabbi. So in exasperation, the lonely rabbi called on God, and he said, God, if I am right, send me a sign directly. And a great voice boomed down from heaven, this man is right. And the noisy rabbis didn't stop. They told God to shut up because they had the real word of the Lord written down on tablets, Moses, Mount Sinai. They had a written text. It shows, I think, 2 things: the incredible tenacious scholarship of the rabbis and the veneration they accorded the written word. It stands, and has always stood, at the heart of Judaism. And it stands at the heart of every synagogue, too. Protected by curtains and doors, the Holy Law. Still written on vellum scrolls, handmade, handwritten by scribes, exactly as texts were thousands upon thousands of years ago. The texts of the Hebrew Bible go back 2, 3, 4, perhaps even 5,000 years. But they reach their final form, the shape in which we have them today, between 2 distinctive events. One, the Babylonian exile of the Jews, and the other one was the destruction of Jerusalem itself by the Romans. Jerusalem is the city of the Old Testament. It was King David's city. It was the heart of ancient Israel, and the faraway home that the exiled prophets saw in their mind's eye as they sat writing by the waters of Babylon. Even when the Jews had spread right throughout the ancient world, Jerusalem, with its great temple and its priests, stood at the center of the faith. All around the eastern hills of Jerusalem, the dead are lying waiting for the Last Judgment. Jews, Christians, Muslims alike. We're all expecting, so tradition goes, for the Lord to appear in that blocked-up gate over there and deliver the judgment. I suppose over all of old Jerusalem, there's a terrible stillness, a terrible feeling of waiting. I think it's a feeling that was born in exile, particularly the exile of the Jews in Babylon 600 years before Christ. Now, it was the Persians who let them come back. They were there for about 2 generations. When they started to come back, they were very different people to the ones that had left Jerusalem 40, 50 years before. The leader of the first party actually had a pagan name, Zerubbabel, the seed of Babylon. And he it was who started to rebuild the temple here. There was a rebirth of nationalism. The next generations of people had old Israelite names, Ezra, Nehemiah, people like that. So there was a difference. Now there was an understanding of history that had never been before. In fact, Judeans had left, but Jews had come back. The word was invented in Babylon. The Old Testament says that Ezra and Nehemiah, 2 prominent Jews of Babylon, went to Jerusalem at about a time that we would call 450 BC. Then it is said Nehemiah had found the walls of the city so weak that foxes were jumping over them and knocking them down. And so he set the local population to rebuilding them. They were also building at that time something yet more precious, the Bible itself. It's very, very difficult to find out what was going on. Nehemiah's not in these walls, he's in this book, and that's all there is. So we have to rely on what the book itself tells us about its own history. And that's rather interesting for this period, this vital period. Ezra, it said, gathered all the people of Jerusalem. around him when he got here and read out the law to them. He read it out like a riot act, actually, because they were doing things they weren't supposed to do. Now, what was this holy law? It's obviously something written down, and it seems to have been something written down by Ezra himself, because the Bible tells us again, in another bit, that Ezra received the light of understanding from Jehovah and dictated the holy writings to the scribes. Now, that seems to put you in mind of somebody actually writing down a whole lot of verbal material, stuff remembered by priests over hundreds of years. But there must have been writing earlier. Obviously, Israel was quite a literate society, and there is one little memory in this Bible of a very ancient writing. In the 6th century BC, one of King Josiah's priests finds the Holy Scriptures lying around in the temple. So there you are. There is a sacred book of some description or other from the 6th century. That's as old as we can go, I'm afraid. There's no earlier mentions at all. In the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jews were becoming a truly international people. Excavations here at the island of Elephantine on the Egyptian Nile have uncovered the remains of one of these far-flung Jewish communities. What is especially fascinating is that Judaism here was in many ways quite different from that of Ezra's at Jerusalem. At places like this, you can start to dig up a part of the real world of ancient Judaism, as it existed outside the pages of the Bible. And this at precisely the same time as many of the Bible's books were being written. This is the vast old enclosure wall of the temple of the god Khnum. And in the 5th century BC, in the Persian period, just behind it, in fact just over here, were little houses. And these houses seem to have been for the Jewish community, because in one of them was found a really remarkable lot of letters. And these letters are really important for the history of the Bible, because they show us a picture of a Judaism, a pious Judaism, which is very, very different from the Judaism of Ezra in Jerusalem. Now, this Jehovah here was worshipped in a small temple in a little building of sandstone and gold, and there were other gods in there as well, perhaps local Egyptian gods that came in as well. Now, the Jewish community turned up in this temple and they sung biblical psalms in it, but they intermarried freely with the local population, and they broke the Jewish law in many other ways, at least the Orthodox Jerusalem law. All these different sorts of Judaism had an influence on the Bible, but Ezra's would be the most important. The Jehovah which Ezra had in mind was one which had given out holy laws, and the priests around Ezra were the people who kept and held these holy laws. This is a God that you can actually interact with in a positive way. You can go along and you can say, I will do this and this and this, I will give this in the temple, I will listen to the priest, he will tell me this secret. And you get a God who is doing things in direct alliance with you. You are in alliance with God. You actually can affect your own destiny. This idea of man working, actively affecting his own destiny as an individual was hardly unique to Ezra or the returning Jews at Jerusalem. The Greeks, for example, had been working in the Middle East, going all through the ancient towns, visiting the ancient temples, discovering, rediscovering sometimes the most ancient history of the gods, making, if you like, stories up about the gods and about men too. They too believed that men could influence their own destiny. But unlike the Jews, they believed that they could influence their destiny by politics and war. And that was an idea which would run through the world like fire. In the 4th century BC, the new Greek ideas were forced into the ancient East by Alexander the Great, who conquered everywhere from Greece to Persia. And wherever Alexander and his armies went, they founded cities, large Greek trading cities, that lasted for 600 and 700 years and more. Their style, International Greek, is known today as Hellenism, and it affected everything from the city's buildings to the people's language, and indeed the very gods themselves. Alexander's Hellenistic cities held a lifestyle in them that Abraham and Moses couldn't have dreamt of. This new way of life would change the Bible and even their vision of God. How exciting it must have been to live in sparkling cities like Ephesus. Can you imagine what it would have been like visiting a town like this? You'd come round the headland in your boat, and there in the cliffs would have been this great sparkling city, full of promise, really. Sort of like an international airport. You'd have come ashore, walked up the main street, the first lighted street in the whole world. You'd have found shops, bars, theatres, brothels, everything. An extraordinary environment. You'd have found people, too, from all over the world. from France, from England. You might have even found a Buddhist monk here from India, preaching. St. Paul, of course, lived in this city for 3 years. And in return, Ephesus exported the goods of Asia Minor. Gold, wheat, wine, pearls, glass, all sorts of things. Anything that would make money. Money, of course, had been invented a little way down the road, just a few hundred years before Ephesus. So there was the whole setup, the whole international trade setup. And out at sea, in Delos, in a good year, some 10,000 head of slaves went through the slave market. Now, it was those slaves that actually created the surplus of wealth in towns like this. The surplus that was gained from trading. Most of the people lived here, lived off the land and lived from it too. The little bit of money that those slaves generated all these palaces, because these were put up mainly by private people, these great villas and all the temples and things around. It's the sort of town, of course, that we in the West are used to, you might say. Look at the tourists here. They walk around, they lounge around, they're quite happy in this town. These squares and streets hold the same spaces in them that modern towns do. Unlike ancient Eastern cities, these Hellenistic cities were open, impious, convenient, man-centered. The first modern cities in the world. And from Egypt to Asia Minor, the Jewish communities in these cities were a major element of their life, filling every position in society, from merchant princes to day labourers, from slaves to slave masters. Perhaps the greatest invention of the Jews in these Hellenistic cities was the synagogue. Synagogue itself is a Greek word. There's no Hebrew equivalent. It means meeting house. Now, the first records we have are about the 2nd century BC. There are already hundreds of them then. This one, which is really the finest that survived since antiquity, it's a lot later than that. It's a magnificent building. It's because it's in the city of Sardis. Sardis was a great trading city. It was at the end of a long road from Asia Minor to Persia. Those lorries are still roaring up and down a new road built on top of it. That's where the Jews of Sardis got their wealth to build this splendid building. So these Jewish meeting houses, they were used for a variety of purposes. But the most important thing that went on in these synagogues was the study of the law and the reading of the holy books. The law, of course, was the very heart of Judaism. Its observance, its strict observance, was what kept the whole community and the idea of Judaism together. And never did it need to be studied with such care as in these Hellenistic cities. Because everywhere the Jews went, they walked on a knife edge, on the knife edge of breaking the holy covenants. I mean, it's a million examples I could pick. Take a couple of the 10 Commandments. You shan't have any graven images. Well, Hellenistic cities are full of graven images. They're full of statues. Every little pillar top might have a little face in it or anything like that. The very money in your pocket has been stamped with a graven image. What do you do about it? Do you carry money? Are you allowed to touch it? Is it clean? How near can you go to statues? Can you walk under colonnades? All these questions concerning the law, these ancient laws, which were suddenly brought into high relief in these new cities. This is style. You know, this is Greek culture as a style. And it's a very important thing in the story of the Bible. Everybody wanted to be Greek. And of course, the Jews in these cities wanted to join in that too. There were Jews living in these cities hundreds of years before this library was born, who were already only speaking Greek, who were thinking in Greek ways. They changed their name to Greek names. Simon was a very popular name. It was a sort of adaptation of the old Hebrew Shimon. And of course, you'd expect the great Hebrew holy text, our Old Testament, to be translated into this new language for this new sort of Jewish person. There's a lovely legend about it. The story is that in Alexandria in Egypt in the 2nd century before Christ, 72 scholars were engaged to translate the Holy Scriptures. They were put on a sandbank in the sea outside the city in little huts. And they all sat down and they wrote out the Holy Hebrew Scriptures, and by the grace of God, each one of their translations was the same as the other. The translation is called the Septuagint, so there were 72 of these scribes, 6 for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So now, lots of Jewish people only read their sacred books in Greek. But great numbers of them disapproved of the translation. They suddenly realised their heroes, Abraham, Isaac, and all those other founding fathers, according to the lights and virtues of Hellenism, had been rather funny people. Cheats, sheep stealers, robbers, liars, thieves, butcherers of guests. It looked bad. Suddenly the Jewish culture had been exposed to what was really the desire, the dream of everybody, and it didn't look too good. There's a desire to join this wondrous new culture and all its riches, and at the same time, there's a sort of tension that you don't want to lose your Jewishness. Greekness, that single essential requirement in Hellenism, wasn't just an attitude of mind, a way of thought, a way of talking. It was also actually a way of being. It was body as well as mind. In places like this, there were dozens and dozens of statues of marble athletes. It's a particular sort of a body image, which I suppose is, come down with us today, even a dear old Rambo. Here they all are then, and if you didn't join them down the gymnasium, you'd never become a man of substance and position in Hellenistic society. Yet for Jews to enter places like this, there are a certain number of problems. Let's pretend a young Jewish chap has said, oh, yeah, forget it all, I'll buy myself a nice Daz white toga and go off and join the lads, I'm leaving the race behind me, and he came here. A major and individual and a personal problem would arise because all these events here, all the training was done in the nude. And our poor old Jewish chap, who'd been circumcised when he was a lad, would have stood out like a sore thumb. Everybody would have thought, you know, who's this nouveau Johnny-come-lately wanting to join us, ha-ha. So, believe it or not, there was an extraordinary operation devised called an epispasm, which consisted of actually disguising the effects of circumcision. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing. It's one of those terrible cultural distortions that is so depressing to read about in any period of history, really. On balance, inside all the stresses and strains that were going on in Judaism, it seemed that Hellenism would eventually win out. In the 2nd century BC, it's reported that the high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem had actually knocked off work early, that is, left the rituals of the temple to go and watch athletes practicing in a gymnasium. Well, the sophisticates of Jerusalem were already Hellenized, but the country people and their priests were outraged, and there was a great kerfuffle about it. Not nearly such a kerfuffle as a few years later, when a Syrian Hellenistic prince actually invaded the state of Israel itself. I suppose his idea was that he would bring all the advantages of Hellenism to these barbarous people. It's amazing what he did. He actually invaded Jerusalem. He set up a pagan altar in the temple. He forbade the reading of Hebrew scriptures, and he forbade circumcision. Well, that was enough for the Jews. I mean, they might like Hellenism and its columns, but they weren't going that far. And in an amazing cultural convulsion, they gathered together around a dynasty of country priests called the Maccabees and threw the Syrian prince out. More than that, they actually established a holy state of Israel with the Maccabee princes as sort of kings, priest kings of the holy state of Israel. The priest kings ruled in bloody succession for 100 years before the Romans conquered all of the Hellenistic East. And with it, Judea and Jerusalem. Generally, the Romans were always happy to rule through local client kings. Their puppet in Judea was perhaps the most infamous of all of them, King Herod the Great. 19 years before the birth of Christ, King Herod, wicked King Herod, issued a proclamation to the somewhat startled inhabitants of Jerusalem. A bit of it went like this. Since I am now, by God's will, your governor, and have had peace a long time and gained great riches, and what is the main thing of all, I am very well regarded by the Romans, who, if I may say, are the rulers of the whole world, I will, after the most pious manner suitable to God, render his temple as complete as I am able. Well, nobody would have believed it, but in 10 years, King Herod had practically rebuilt the ancient temple of Jerusalem. When Jesus walked up these steps to go through the door of the temple, he would have had to walk under a Roman eagle. And at the end of the day, the pious Jews really didn't like it. These steps, by the way, weren't just a way of getting into the temple. They were a place for the great academies of Jerusalem. This is where the rabbis came and taught their pupils. This is where the Sadducees and the Pharisees passed. It was where the monkish Essenes used to come and talk to themselves, these strange sects and tribes of Judaism. And above all, perhaps, it was where the zealots came to rouse the rabble. It was where prophets came, where messiahs like Jesus came and talked. Everybody came on these steps and talked. And in the end, that ferment, that hatred of things foreign, the hatred of the foreign image above everything, and the hatred of foreigners on the pure, sacred soil of Israel caused the explosion. The balancing act collapsed. Less than 100 years after King Herod, his temple was absolutely swept off the face of the earth by the Roman army. Jerusalem, the golden city, was destroyed, starved, then burnt after a long siege. So not only was Jehovah's temple destroyed, but the priesthood too, and with it the heart of the ancient Jewish state. The Romans left Judea completely ruined, inhabited by a nation that had lost its centre. It was at this terrible time that the Hebrew Bible, Christianity's Old Testament, would be finally put together. You know, when history books say grand things like the city of Jerusalem was swept from the face of the earth in 70 AD, it doesn't begin to tell you what went on in the streets, does it? Well, this little ruin here does. That over there was the door of this part of the house. The soldiers must have come through this room, and this room, knocking things over as they went, smashing everything before they set fire to it. Bits of human body were found in here. A couple of spears, things like that. Everything smashed, destroyed, carbonized. Look at the walls there, covered in black soot. The plaster burnt red behind. The whole place, in fact, utterly destroyed. It's interesting. This house is actually on the eastern hill overlooking the temple. It's part of an enormous estate of the priests. The priests, in fact, who ruled the state of Judea, the Jewish people. These were rich people. These were Hellenized. Look at that table. You'll see lots of little Hellenic details. Even their name is Greek, Cathros, the house of Cathros. These were conservative, pragmatic people who'd done deals with the Romans. Josephus, the historian, had already given himself up to the Romans after fighting in Galilee in the north, and he'd cleverly made friends with the Emperor Vespasian, and he actually watched the destruction of Jerusalem with the Roman army. Vespasian, Josephus tells us, was rather upset to see his new friend so worried about what had happened to his country, and he asked him if there was anything he wanted from the ruins of the city. Perhaps he wanted to cheer the old scholar up. And Josephus asked only for the holy books. He knew that there must be still fragments of them laying in the ruins of the burnt city, and he went back there and he tells us he picked them up from amongst the embers, these charred remains of the sacred texts of his race. What were they? That's an important question, because these would become the fixed version of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian's Old Testament. Well, the bits that Josephus actually picked up we don't know about, but we do know what the sacred texts were in Jerusalem just before the Roman army approached, because the people of Jerusalem went out and buried large quantities of them in the deserts of Judea to save them from their enemies. That, at any rate, seems to be the best explanation of how masses of scrolls came to be found in a lot of desert caves. Scrolls that today are half the history of the Bible. And yet they're surrounded by so many confusions and mysteries that their real importance is often difficult to see. It's obviously no accident that the world's greatest archaeological discoveries have been found in bone-dry desert caves. Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The world's oldest Bible books here in the Judean desert. The incredible dryness. In places like this will preserve almost anything. In these caves were found the Dead Sea Scrolls. What a find it was by the Dead Sea. There were nearly 1,000 documents here, all written on copper, on leather, on vellum, even on fragile papyrus.
Scholars at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem undertake the painstaking work of piecing together bits of ancient biblical scrolls found in a mountain cave near the Dead Sea. This parchment document was written 2,000 years ago.
There were 75 copies of the books of Moses, 48 of the prophets, 57 of the histories and psalms, and there were tens of thousands of loose fragments and dozens of different versions of the same texts, and even some holy texts that no one had ever seen before. For Jews and Christians alike, the Dead Sea Scrolls promised revelations, even nasty shocks. From the first days of the discovery, there were rumors that some of the scrolls would change our understanding of the Bible forever. You know, the Bible texts weren't the only things that were found in these caves. There was a wonderful scroll describing the exact locations of huge amounts of buried treasure. There was another wondrous document which actually talked about the great battle that was going to take place at the end of the world. The battle, it was said, of the sons of light and darkness. And then there were several rule books. And these seemed to be rule books of a sort of a religious order. And when these scrolls were first found, these were some of the very first texts that people started to read. And the scholars suggested immediately that it was actually a sort of a rule book of a sect of Judaism called Essenes. These mysterious Essenes would provide an alibi for many scholars who studied the Dead Sea Scrolls. If the ancient texts had been made by the members of this unusual sect, then any impieties or aberrations in them that might offend Jews or Christians could be put down to Essene oddness. Close by the caves where the first scrolls had been discovered was an insignificant ancient ruin, a lookout post apparently destroyed in an ancient war. Now, the scroll scholars were filled with a great desire to dig it up. Perhaps this ruin, which was clearly connected to the caves nearby, could now also be connected with the Essenes. And so, it was declared that this ancient fortress had actually been an Essene monastery, and that the Dead Sea Scrolls, with all their amazing diversity, had actually been made and stored in it. I stand like a lion upon the watchtower, said the prophets, and that's what the archaeologists dug up. And it stood high above the sea, the Dead Sea, guarding a great road that came up the side and turned off this way, off to Jericho in Jerusalem. The archaeologists found Roman arrowheads still stuck in the walls, and Roman sappers too had dug underneath and destroyed the place. And this had probably happened when the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem and were on their way down the coast to wipe up the remaining Jews that had run out of the capital on the way. But still, these archaeologists, these same people, thought that they dug up an Essene monastery, this strange sect they said that had probably written the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, why would they have said that? Pliny, who's the best ancient authority on the Essenes, says that the Essenes lived without women, without money, but under palm trees by the Dead Sea. Well, there's the Dead Sea. But over there is this cemetery of this little fortress, and there were found women there. And here, in the so-called monastery, they found money hidden under the floor. And as you can see for yourself, there are no palm trees. And the archaeologists proved by digging the place up they didn't find any palm tree roots either. There never had been any palm trees here. So why on earth did they persist in calling this an Essene monastery? Well, I think it's mainly because of one room. And this room they called the scriptorium, and they said that was where the Dead Sea Scrolls had probably been written. This, then, is the doorway of the famous Qumran scriptorium. Now, why did the excavators call this little room that? Well, they quickly found that there'd been a second story on this room, and that it had collapsed. And when it collapsed, a whole lot of plasterwork had fallen down onto the floor, along here somewhere. And this, when they stuck it all back together again, looked very much like a lot of benches. And then, amazing fact, they found a lot of ancient inkwells by these benches. And the ink they discovered was exactly the same as the ink that had been used in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then again, they found pottery. They found tons of pottery right through this place, of exactly similar type to that which was found in the caves with the scrolls. So, this room became the scriptorium. And to the masses of tourists that come through here, it still is. But the story doesn't finish there. Look, those plaster benches turned out to be something far more peculiar and far less like benches. The inkwells, well, why shouldn't a fortress have an inkwell? And you'd expect it to have ancient ink in it, wouldn't you? So that's fair enough. As for the pottery, well, that sort of pottery you can find everywhere, here from Jerusalem to Thebes and Egypt. It's common enough for the period. So why then do you so desperately need it? Why do you need all these hundreds of monks in here, writing all these versions of the Bible? An incredible and strange story, given that there hasn't been one Essene object found in this entire place. It was needed because for many scholars, the Dead Sea Scrolls had to be kept at a safe distance from the centre of the ancient faith. Their very oddness needed to be isolated from Jerusalem, the centre of Orthodox piety. And for that, the Essene monks provided a convenient umbrella. By the shores of the Dead Sea, down the road from Qumran, is the legendary Rock of Masada. After the fall of Jerusalem, a band of Jewish warriors and their families withstood a long Roman siege here and then committed suicide. During the siege, the defenders had built themselves a small synagogue, now the oldest standing synagogue in the world. From the area around this synagogue, the archaeologists found some 14 scrolls and fragments of scrolls which are exactly similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. Now, right away, this makes the whole story a lot wider, doesn't it? The question is, you've got really two alternatives how they got here. Were these the so-called monks that lived in Qumran who suddenly had abandoned their pacifist ideals, run away from the Romans and come up here with their scrolls to die with the gallant defenders of Masada? Or was it just the fact that the Masada people who had come from Jerusalem simply brought the scrolls with them? The difference is a very important one, because you come back to the question, were the scrolls made at Qumran or were they made in Jerusalem? Now, it's a brilliant new theory that really substantiates this idea of them coming from Jerusalem. And it's based on the contents of one of the scrolls themselves. This one's unique. It's a copper scroll. The letters engraved on a thin sheet of copper. They really wanted this one to last. And this one is a treasure list. There's nothing less than a list of things buried in and around Jerusalem. This one can imagine, presumably at the time the Roman army was coming down from the north to attack and eventually destroy the city. Now, all this seems like a nice scholarly debate, isn't it? But it's very important for the history of the Bible, and it's important for this reason. If those texts come from Jerusalem, they show us the precise state of the Hebrew Bible at the very time of the ending of the Jewish state. So, if that's true, what does it mean? It means that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, hasn't yet been gathered together. It's still lots and lots of different books in lots and lots of different versions. That means then there was never one single original Hebrew Bible. At the time of the ending of the Jewish state, it was still waiting to be put together. In the century after Jerusalem was destroyed, great rabbis and teachers, like Rabbi Yochanan ben, wandered the country, being forced ever further northwards as the Roman wars engulfed more and more of the land. They taught and they preached in little synagogues like this one. They spent a lot of their time giving advice to people about the correct forms of ritual behavior, things that earlier would have been decided by the priests in Jerusalem in verbal argument. There are hundreds of legendary stories about these rabbis. Sometimes, too, the learned academies they founded. They were great teachers, they were great disputers. They would travel distances to see each other, to have arguments, sometimes to discuss points of law. To remember, perhaps, too, the old academies they'd been at in Jerusalem. And then there were generations of students that followed them, in precisely the same way. But the most important work of these rabbis, and it was the most important work, was to memorialize on paper the ritual, the records, and the whole ethos of Judaism, the Judaism that was so near to extinction. Over several generations, all the leaders of Judaism gathered together. The scholars and the rabbis from the great cities of the East, from Babylon and Alexandria. The survivors, too, of the priesthood and the schools of Old Jerusalem, all gathered now to build the sacred books into a Bible. So the first thing the scribes had to do was to sit down and make sure that the rabbis were dealing with a text that were consistent. Every line had to be the same from one version to the other, and that was quite a thing to decide on. It said that one little scribe, in one night, burned an extra 100 measures of oil, just preparing the book of Ezekiel for the rabbis to examine next day. The rabbis, of course, examined whole books. They had no trouble with the center of the faith, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. They obviously had no trouble with the book of Kings and the books of Judges. These great books automatically could not but be included in the canon of religious texts. But there were later books that caused much more problems. Book of Esther, for example, had been written by a woman. That was a bit dodgy in itself. So they cut it in half and kicked half out and left half in. There was the Book of Maccabees, which was a splendid Greek history, but didn't seem too religious, so that went out. In fact, there's quite a collection of them that went out. And funnily enough, the Christians had already included them in their Old Testament. When they discovered that the rabbis had later left them out, they sort of pushed them to one side, so they became the Christian Apocrypha. But it's very difficult talking about this stuff, because you don't have any proper record of what went on. What you have is dozens and dozens of marvellous stories, especially of the rabbis that seem to dominate the proceedings. And one of these, and typical of them, was a man called Rabbi Akiva, a man considered so intelligent that Moses himself couldn't understand him. There's a wonderful story of how actually he saved the Song of Songs, that great erotic poem, for our Bible. And the story goes that they were having a meeting and people were getting really worried about the Song of Songs. Should this marvellous piece of literature go into a sacred volume? And Akiva, who wasn't exactly known for his liberal attitudes. I mean, when one of his parishioners came to him and said he was contemplating suicide, Akiva told him he used a strong rope. So, Akiva addressed the meeting, so the story goes, and he said, brothers, all the sacred texts are sacred, but the Song of Songs is the most sacred of all. What he meant was, I think, that the Song of Songs, that piece of pure erotica, should be in the Bible because the Bible should represent the whole body of man from its beginning to its end, and therefore needed something like that in the middle. So it's through these legendary debates that the Bible has come down to us today, and through men, through legendary figures like Akiva himself. Akiva came to a terrible end. This is his tomb. Seems that when the old man was about 70, he went on the warpath. I think he must have decided that what he really wanted to do was to go back to the Jerusalem of his youth, when the temple was there and when the great scribal academies and studying had been all over the great city. So he got a local resistance leader and christened him as the Messiah, and together they set Judea alight. The war went on for 5 years. We don't know much about it. It was quite terrible. The old Jewish histories tell us that the Roman cavalry charges, at the end, the horses were wading in blood up to their chests. Some of the Jews committed suicide, wrapping their children in the sacred scrolls and setting fire to them. Akiva himself was captured. He refused to give up teaching the law, and the Romans tortured him to death, combing the flesh from his body, it is said, with combs of iron. Well, as many Jews had done in such final moments, Akiva started to recite the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. Then he suddenly stopped and smiled. And the torturers, who were obviously not used to such things, were quite alarmed at this, and they stepped back from him and said, old man, why do you mock us? What are you doing? Obviously frightened at his power. And Akiva said, calm yourselves. I've just realized for the first time in my life a new meaning for these verses, and started out on a learned exposition, the last of his life, with this old guardian of the sacred scriptures, delivered to his Roman torturers. And with that, as the Jewish history says, the old man gave up his soul to God. That sacred text was guarded by the care of scribes and scholars for thousands of years after Akiva's time. It stayed the same, though they had one major task in hand. You see, as the Jews spread out through the Mediterranean, up into Europe in the diaspora, their accents changed. So the old system of writing Hebrew, which was mainly in consonants, didn't work anymore because as people read it, it sounded different and seemed to mean different things. So the scribes invented an elaborate system of vowels, and they also started to space the words and the sentences and the paragraphs for the first time. But can you imagine the care? Really, 1,500 years of careful copying. And can you imagine, too, how wonderful it must have seemed when printing came along? How you could set up a page of type, make sure it was absolutely correct, and then print off hundreds and hundreds of copies. And so, within 30 years of Gutenberg printing the first Bible, Jews printed a Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. And this is it, a copy of the first printed Hebrew Bible, made in the 1480s, most of them. And there's the sacred text up there. And you see how it's become surrounded by this scholarship, like a great protection around the Holy Word. It's a marvel of printing. In fact, the whole book is an extraordinary story. Christians didn't want Jews printing things. They were hounded out. There was a duke in Milan who allowed a little family of Jewish printers to settle in a village called Soncino. And from that village, Jewish printers were trained who went out with portable printing presses all over Europe, actually from Spain to Istanbul. And they printed what are now called these Soncino Bibles in many different towns. Small Bibles, fugitive Bibles, you might say. Luther used one of these when he was on the run, when he was translating a Protestant Bible, the sort of father of all Protestant Bibles. He used the Soncino Bible. Now, the Catholic Church, too, was very interested in the new scholarship and was evolving whilst printing was coming up. This extraordinary work here is one of the earliest examples of this new scholarship that went with printing, really. The Complutensian Polyglot. It's wonderful, isn't it? Polyglot means many languages. Complutensis is the town in Spain, Alcala, where it was printed by a very proud Catholic cardinal. There's his coat of arms and his hat, a magnificent Renaissance title page. Now, the book is a major work of scholarship, and for the first time in history, all the versions of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament have been brought together on one page, the three major versions of the West. Here is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text made before Christ, the Septuagint, in the Hellenistic cities. There is the Soncino Bible, that text copied from those first printed Bibles. And there in the middle, the Orthodox Latin text of the Catholic Church. The cardinal says that these two volumes hang like thieves either side of Christ, talking about the Orthodox Latin. That's not quite the end of the Hebrew Bible. You see, the Soncino Bibles weren't as precise as Jewish scholarship would like it. And so 20 years later, in the 1520s in Venice, a Tunisian Jew called Jacob ben Chaim edited the text of the Jewish Bible that we still have today. And this is a copy of it. Look, magnificent Renaissance binding. This is a product of some of the finest printers of the Renaissance, printed in Venice in the High Renaissance. Look at the title page with the new architecture on it. And there the Hebrew language in the middle. A magnificent volume. And literally the same text you'll find in Hebrew Bibles today. And there it is, again, the Bible itself, covered by the commentary. And the most curious thing is, perhaps, that he worked and was paid by a Christian, Daniele Bomberg. Bomberg believed that really the roots of Christian religion lay in this book, the Hebrew Bible. And he and his sons continued to produce these books for generations. In fact, they actually had to get special permission for the Jews of Venice to leave the ghetto to come and work in his Christian print studio. And he got special permission, too, for them to leave their yellow hats behind that they always had to wear outside the ghetto. Ben Chaim said of his work that Bomberg was sent to him by God. He asked me to purify the text, and he said, I worked on it, I worked on the words, I worked on the marks, and I worked on the phrases, until they was polished silver and purified gold.
An authentic copy must be the exemplar from which the transcriber ought not in the least to deviate. No word or letter, not even a jot, must be written from memory. Between every consonant, the space of a hair or thread must intervene. Between every word, the breadth of a narrow consonant. Between every new section, the breadth of 9 consonants. Between every book, 3 lines. The 5th book of Moses must terminate exactly with a line. The copyist must sit in full Jewish dress, wash his whole body, not begin to write the name of God with pen newly dipped in ink, and should a king address him while writing that name, he must take no notice of him.